What's up, y'all? My name is JR, and for those of you who don't already know, I'm a huge movie and TV nerd. If you're new here, I appreciate you taking the time to check out my channel. I hope you consider sticking around and joining the film community I'm trying to build here on YouTube. So in today's video, I'm going to be giving my reaction and review of Kevin Williams' latest slasher film, Scream 7. And just so you guys know, this video will contain spoilers, so if you haven't gotten around to going to the theaters to see this movie yet and you don't want to know anything that happens in it, you might want to exit this video now. And with that being said, no more wasting time. Let's get into it. Scream 7 is an American-made slasher film that functions as a sequel to Scream 6 and is the seventh installment in the Scream film series. It's directed by Kevin Williamson from a screenplay he co-wrote with Guy Busick from a story by James Vanderbilt and Busick. The film stars Neve Campbell, Jasmine Savoy Brown, Mason Gooding, David Arquette, Matthew Lillard, and Courtney Cox, reprising their roles from previous films with Isabel May, Anna Camp, Michelle Randolph, Jimmy Tatro, McKenna Grace, Asa German, Celeste O'Connor, Sam Rechner, Mark Consuelos, Tim Simmons, and Joel McHale, also starring. And the film follows a new Ghostface killer who targets Sidney Prescott's daughter, Tatum. Now, following the exit of Scream from 2022 and Scream 6 directors Matt Bettinelli, Opland, and Tyler Gillett in August of 2023, Christopher Landon was hired to direct the seventh Scream film. However, the film went through a creative retooling after the departure of stars Melissa Barrera and Jenna Ortega in late 2023. And some of you may have heard about all that stuff about her with the comments surrounding Palestine and how she was replaced in the movie because of them. Now, Landon also left the project. In March of 2024, Campbell confirmed her return to the franchise after being absent from Scream 6, with Williamson hired to direct Scream 7 after serving as writer and producer of the early films in the series. And filming on this movie began in January of 2025, and it concluded in March. Scream 7 premiered at the Paramount Pictures studio lot on February 25th of 2026 and was released in the United States on February 27th by Paramount Pictures. And to this point, the film has received negative reviews from critics. In fact, at the time of the making of this video, the movie has a meager 34% on Rotten Tomatoes based on 135 critic reviews, with its popcorn meter currently sitting at 78% based on over 2,500 verified ratings. The movie has a Metascore of 36 on Metacritic based on just 37 critic reviews, with a user score of 5.1 based on 64 user ratings. And finally, the movie has a 6.0 out of 10 on IMDb with almost 1,000 ratings. Now, Scream, in my mind, got off to a great start. In fact, I think the first movie did a lot to elevate the genre as a whole. Its biggest contribution, in my mind, being the use of multiple masked killers, adding a sense of mystery to the horror, thriller, slasher film. And even though Ghostface was a bit clumsier than the masked killers that came before him, and I'm basically talking about Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, the mystery element being added to the story worked for the first film and for the first few films that followed. But just like any other film franchise that goes on as long as this one has, you have to be able to adapt creatively, and this franchise has done very little of that over the years, seeming to depend solely on Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, and John Arquette, as they all play beloved characters to get people to show up at the theaters. But eventually those characters have to die, or they otherwise age out, or, the series just gets so popular that you can't afford to pay them what they're asking. And that's what we get here when we saw Dewey die a couple of films ago, which leaves us with just Sidney and Gale, and then whoever the series taps to pick up the mantle of Sidney Prescott to keep the franchise alive moving forward. And that's where we sit currently, with Scream 7 attempting to move on. Well, Scream 6, attempted to move on from Campbell, only to find it impossible at this particular time. So it was with that in mind that I walked into, surprisingly, a fairly crowded theater here in my town. For the day and time, I decided to go and see this movie with a fairly good understanding of what exactly it was I would see, given the trailer and the log line attached to this particular story. And after leaving the theater, my main thought is that this film was about exactly what I expected it to be. Now, it starts off in typical Scream fashion with essentially a cold open that, to my delight, involves Michelle Randolph, who I absolutely love to see in any television show or film right now. And I think she does a decent job of being a Scream queen, though the cold open does take about 10 minutes to kind of get going before essentially getting down to business. And from there, we get the main story involving Sidney and her 17-year-old daughter Tatum, which felt like an attempt to anoint Isabel May as the new queen of the franchise, though I'm not quite sure that's going to work the way that studio thinks. I guess we'll have to wait and see what the box office numbers have to say about that. And again, the theater that I was in was fairly crowded for the day and time that I went, so maybe this movie's going to do big numbers, but, that's yet to be seen. But the story centers around Tatum and her wanting to know about her mother's past, and her mother's unwillingness to share that past with her daughter in an attempt to protect her from it. But then a familiar face resurfaces just as people around Sidney and Tatum start dying, and the film spends a lot of narrative energy trying to convince the audience that none other than Stu Macher isn't dead after all, and that he's come back for Sidney in a revenge plot. And look, shout out to Matthew Lillard for jumping back into what I believe to be his most iconic role. But this film was crammed full of cameos from characters past, which kind of makes Lillard's inclusion less potent than it would have been otherwise. But I digress. And, of course, we're treated to the return of Gale Weathers, which I thought was an overall plus. I'm a huge Friends fan, so Courtney Cox, I'm down for whatever she decides she wants to do, even at this stage in her career. And we also get Mindy and Chad Meeks Martin, first introduced to us back in Scream 5, who are now working as interns for Gale, which, if I'm being honest, I could have done without, even though they are there filling the role that was originally held by Randy in the first film, and by that I mean they're essentially there to continue to educate the younger characters about how to survive a modern horror film, just like they did in the earlier films that they've appeared in. Now, this movie does even more than the Scream movies before it in the way of moving the cups around the table, so to speak, so as to keep the audience from truly being able to guess who the killers are until the very last minute. And let's be honest, that's really what these movies have historically always been about. They've always featured multiple killers donning the Ghostface costume. Thus, historically, they've been a lot better than other films at hiding the killers until the very end of the film, simply due to that fact. And here, there's not just two characters, there's three. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie yet. And add to that the currently topical use of AI by the killers, and I guess that was a way for the filmmakers to kind of up the ante here, with one of the killers even killing someone that truly makes the unmasking of the killers at the end even more of a surprise, not just from a narrative perspective, but also for logistical reasons as well. Now, I thought that both Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox did their typical Sidney Prescott and Gale Weathers things in this movie. I did like Anna Camp in her role. I thought the writers played a bit fast and loose with who survived their encounters with Ghostface or with the Ghostface killers and who didn't. But again, I understood that they were doing it to try to keep the audience on their toes throughout the film. I also thought there were too many retreaded ideas from previous Scream films, so not enough creativity from a narrative perspective, but this just goes to show you that they've made too many of these movies at this point. I also thought there were one or two instances where characters did things that the characters would not do without the writers putting their thumb on the scales. For example, spoiler alert, Tatum's boyfriend using green screen to make Stu Macher videos and then leaving them on his computer and leaving his computer in the car so that Tatum would see the footage and accuse him of being one of the killers, all before one of the actual killers shows up and eventually kills him off. Also, the writers can keep the audience guessing about who the killers actually were. And I tell you guys all the time, I think that's bad writing. Now, despite that fact, I did actually find the movie quite thrilling, right? Just from that perspective. I thought the movie had some of the more brutally creative kills the franchise have ever seen. There's a couple doozies in this movie, I'm just going to tell you. And speaking of the killing, it started fairly early in the main story, and it was the life's blood that kind of kept up the pace of the story throughout. Now, the main thematic idea of the film here being that Sidney, by going so far to protect Tatum, has kind of taken away Tatum's ability to learn to protect herself. And so that's kind of what this iteration of the franchise is about. Tatum getting to the point where she finds it within herself to be more like her mother, who has been the epitome of a survivor throughout the franchise. I think we can all agree on that. Now, where I thought this film failed spectacularly was the ceremonial unmasking of the killers at the end of the film and the dissemination of their motives. I gotta say, I just wasn't moved, right? It just didn't make sense narratively or logistically, especially given the fact that Anna Camp's Jessica Bowden killed her own damn son in the process of chasing down Tatum in order to get to Sidney. And the reason she gives for wanting to terrorize and kill Sidney was that Sidney disappeared from public life and therefore took away her ability to kind of worship her as this survivor. You know, I was just like, they're really running out of gas here with the whys. I always tell you guys, the why is going to be what determines whether or not you have a good movie. It's not the who or the what. It's going to be the why that's going to have the most to say about whether or not your movie's good. And so I just, like I said, with this, I wasn't moved. I wasn't moved at all. And on top of that, I found it hard to understand why the pair of killers who were ultimately revealed would go through all the trouble of traveling to Woodsboro and killing Scott and Madison, you know, the random-ass couple staying in the Scream Airbnb, then burn the house to the ground for good measure in the movie's cold open. And I get what this scene means symbolically, right? A decision that kind of moves the franchise away from its 30-year legacy, though I don't know why you would want to do something like that. If you're going to keep making these movies, why would you go, hey, screw the last 30 years. We're on to something different now. Unless you're telling me that Scream 7 is the last one, which I highly doubt. But let's keep the trains, running on time here. But the house is serving as, a now destroyed landmark for would-be true crime fans. And I also get that the Ghostface killer in the cold open could be someone completely separate from the killers in the main story. In fact, given that the crime isn't mentioned during the unmasking, especially when every other detail of the pair's plan is mentioned, I would certainly argue that the Ghostface could be somebody completely different in the cold open. But if that's the case, then what kind of narrative sense would it make? I just don't understand why you even show us the cold open with a different killer from the main story. Because now what it feels like is you got me watching a Scream short film, and then now we're going to get ready to show you the actual film. It makes it feel like two films, and it just didn't make a whole lot of narrative sense to me. I was blown. Now, overall, I'd give this movie a 55%. Or a 5.5 out of 10 if you're thinking IMDb score. Essentially a D- for a letter grade. Now, as I stated earlier in this video, this movie was pretty much exactly what I expected it to be, almost from start to finish. It's one of those movies that, over time, has become very Fast and Furious-like in its storytelling, wherein the first movie is new and interesting and fresh, and then every movie that comes after that is just the filmmaker's attempt to out-scream the screams that have ever been scrumped, which tends to take the writing to a place where you have to truly abandon all logic and realism in a movie that's supposed to exist in the real world. Sure, Ghostface is more of a cartoonish type of slasher killer, but these movies are still supposed to take place in the real world. And so, when you have to go so far to suspend your disbelief, it starts to get to a point where you just kind of go, I don't know. It feels like a lot. So, before you go see this film, you need to understand this movie is simply fan service from start to finish, right? This is the kind of movie that only true Scream fans will really, really like. And this is all being done while the studio just tries to squeeze just a little bit more blood out of what I believe at this point has become a fairly dry turnip. But what do you guys think? Have you had a chance to get to the theater to see Scream 7 yet? If you have, what did you think about the movie's cold open and what it was apparently trying to say about the franchise moving forward? What did you think about the movie focusing more on the journey of Sidney's daughter than Sidney herself? What did you think specifically about the inclusion of Stu Macher as a red herring? What did you think about the killers and their motivations? And how do you think the franchise will move forward from this particular iteration of the film? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you that might be new to the channel, be sure to like and share this video. If you really like the content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. You can also now support the channel by leaving a super thanks. If you should be so inclined, I greatly appreciate it. Also, feel free to subscribe to my new reactions channel and shorts channel for additional content. The links are in the description. In addition to that, be sure to go and check out themadScreenwriter.com for more television and film reviews and info on my upcoming film projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I got screenplays to write. And I'll catch y'all on the next video.